So, ganz herzlich willkommen, alle, die sich hier eingefunden haben. Ich bin Rahel Jeggi, ich bin Professorin für Sozialphilosophie an der Humboldt-Universität hier und außerdem die Direktorin des Centers for Humanities and Social Change, das diese Veranstaltung hier ausrichtet. Es ist wirklich ein wunderbarer Moment, Sie hier alle heute zu den ersten Walter Benjamin Lectures begrüßen zu dürfen. Sie können sich vorstellen, dass wir, also ich und alle Mitarbeiterinnen meines Centers, seit einiger Zeit mit großem Nachdruck darauf hingearbeitet haben, Sie hier heute zu versammeln. Also ganz besonders natürlich Charles Taylor, der diese ersten Benjamin Lectures halten wird. Alle Kommentatorinnen, die ich Ihnen im Laufe des Abends vorstellen werde. Und natürlich Sie, das Publikum, das hier ist, obwohl es draußen wunderbares Wetter ist und möglicherweise der Badesee etwas mehr lockt als das Sitzen in solchen Räumen hier. Also ganz herzlich willkommen. Wir freuen uns wahnsinnig, dass das hier so geklappt hat und Sie mit uns hier zusammen diesen Auftakt begehen werden. Manchmal klappt das ja, wenn auch nicht so oft, dass Dinge sich genau so umsetzen lassen, wie man sie sich gewünscht hat. Und genau das ist heute hier der Fall. Es ist wirklich großartig, dass wir die Vortragsreihe in genau dieser Besetzung eröffnen können, in der wir hier heute sind. Also tatsächlich unsere Wunschbesetzung. Wir hätten uns, als wir begonnen haben damit, das zu planen, gar nicht träumen lassen, dass Charles Taylor tatsächlich zusagt und dass Maeve Cooke und Patricia Nunz und Shuang Li sagen, hier zusagen und wir in dieser Konstellation in den nächsten Tagen über die Krise der Demokratie reden können. Bevor ich im Einzelnen darauf eingehe, möchte ich Ihnen aber kurz die Reihe selbst vorstellen, die wir hiermit beginnen heute Abend. Die Walter Benjamin Lectures, wie wir sie genannt haben, sind eine Vortragsreihe, die ausgerichtet wird von dem im Frühjahr 2018, also noch gar nicht so lange her, gegründeten Center for Humanities and Social Change, die dank der Finanzierung durch die Humanities and Social Change Foundation jetzt jährlich stattfinden werden. Also das ist tatsächlich der Auftakt einer Veranstaltungsreihe, die jährlich genauso stattfinden sollen, mit jeweils einem prominenten eingeladenenen Redner oder Rednerin und Kommentaren, jeweils auch eben 3 solche Veranstaltungen am Stück. Es handelt sich, so jedenfalls haben wir uns das gedacht, um ein ausgesprochen anspruchsvolles und hoffentlich auch nachhaltiges Format. Was wir nämlich eigentlich nicht wollten, ist dem ohnehin sehr eventverwöhnten und auch prominenzverwöhnten Berlin einfach nur noch eine weitere Gelegenheit zum Promi-Watching hinzuzufügen. Was wir wollen, ist eine Möglichkeit zu schaffen für eine vertiefte und auch ausgedehnte Auseinandersetzung mit einem Thema. Beim Walter Benjamin Chair, wie wir ihn genannt haben, handelt es sich um einen temporären Lehrstuhl sozusagen, den wir jedes Jahr erneut mit einer wichtigen Persönlichkeit, einer Philosophin, einem Philosophen oder Angrenzenden aus dem Feld besetzen werden. Dieser werden während ihres Aufenthalts hier seine Überlegungen zu einem der Themen entwickeln, die im Zusammenhang mit unserem Forschungsthema, dem Thema, unter dem das Center for Humanities and Social Change steht, nämlich die Krisen der Demokratie und des Kapitalismus stehen. Krisen der Demokratie, Krisen des Kapitalismus und möglicherweise der Zusammenhang zwischen beiden. Für Sie bedeutet dieses Format, dass Sie Charles Taylor hier in diesen Tagen nicht nur einmal zu einem sich schnell verflüchtigenden Vortrag hören werden, sondern an 3 aufeinanderfolgenden Tagen, in denen er Gelegenheit hat, sein Thema zu vertiefen. Also ein 3-teiliger Zyklus, in dem man Überlegungen nicht nur anschneiden kann, wie üblicherweise, sondern eben wirklich zur Gänze entwickeln und hoffentlich auch jedenfalls zu einem Teil diskutieren kann. Für uns hier, für uns an der Humboldt-Universität, also für die Studierenden, die Promovierenden, die Fellows, die Mitarbeiterinnen des Centers, die Kolleginnen hier an der HU und auch anderer Berliner Universitäten, für uns bedeutet dieser Walter Benjamin Chair sogar noch mehr, also nicht nur die Gelegenheit, einem solchen Zyklus von Vorträgen zuzuhören, sondern auch die Möglichkeit, mit den eingeladenen Wissenschaftlern, die einige Wochen hier mit uns verbringen, tatsächlich eine eingehendere Auseinandersetzung im Rahmen von wiederholt stattfindenden Kolloquien und verschiedenen Diskussionsreihen einzugehen. In dieser Zeit, so ist jedenfalls die Idee dieses Walter Benjamin Chairs, werden wir jeweils die Themen der Vorlesung schon vordiskutieren. Das haben wir mit Charles Taylor auch schon sehr intensiv betrieben. Wir haben ihn sehr in Anspruch genommen, glaube ich, durch immer weitere Anfragen, immer weitere Termine, bei denen wir sowohl schon über die Themen seine Vorlesungen selber, aber eben auch über Texte, Themen, Bücher, die ihn in diesem Zusammenhang beschäftigen, mit ihm zusammen diskutiert haben. Also diese Art von sozusagen eingehende Auseinandersetzung ist das, was dieser Walter Benjamin Chair hier uns ermöglichen soll, also für die ganze Universität und auch die angrenzenden Institutionen und Universitäten eine Möglichkeit, hier mit Wissenschaftlerinnen in intensivere Auseinandersetzungen zu kommen. Und der Höhepunkt eben jener Zeit des gemeinsamen Diskutierens soll dann jeweils diese dreiteilige Vorlesungsreihe sein. Wir haben nun beschlossen, diesem Chair und dieser Vortragsreihe den Namen Walter Benjamin zu geben, nach dem in Berlin geborenen, wie die meisten von Ihnen wissen, Philosophen Walter Benjamin. Wir sind den Erben Walter Benjamins sehr dankbar, dass Sie Ihre tatsächlich sehr, sehr herzliche Zustimmung zu diesem Plan uns gegeben haben. Die Namensgebung zielt nun nicht nur einfach daraus, dem Projekt so ein bisschen Berliner Lokalkolorit zu geben, sondern hat selbstverständlich einen weitergehenden Sinn. Übrigens hat Sheila Ben-Habib, die hier vorne sitzt, war tatsächlich eine der ersten, die den Anschluss dazu gegeben hat, indem sie gesagt hat, kritische Theorie in Berlin gab es immer schon auch und ist mit dem Namen Walter Benjamin, übrigens natürlich auch mit dem von Herbert Marcuse verbunden. Walter Benjamin, 1892 geboren, 1940 auf der Flucht vor den Nazis unter tragischen Umständen in Porbu ums Leben gekommen, erinnert nicht nur daran, wie viele verschiedene Facetten eine kritische Gesellschaftstheorie haben kann und auch haben muss. Er steht auch, wie ganz wenige andere, mit seiner Lebensgeschichte und seinem Werk für die Krisen und Katastrophen des 20. Jahrhunderts, Krisen, die sich ins 21. Jahrhundert fortgesetzt haben, in jeder denkbaren Weise. Dass es so weitergeht, ist die Katastrophe, hat Benjamin einmal in einer seiner berühmtesten Schriften formuliert und damit vorweggenommen, dass gesellschaftliche Krisen und ihr Fortbestand einen nicht unwesentlichen Teil unserer Realität ausmachen. Und eben das zu untersuchen, zu thematisieren, zu analysieren, ist eine der Aufgaben unseres Centers. Der Name Benjamin Lectures und auch Benjamin Chair soll dabei nicht bedeuten, dass die Vorlesungen sich mit seinem Werk befassen oder befassen müssten. Was wir hier mit dieser Vorlesungsreihe initiieren wollen, sind nicht Vorlesungen über Walter Benjamin, sondern Vorlesungen in seinem Geiste. Und das meint auch mit der philosophischen Anstrengung, aktuelle Krisen zu verstehen und überwinden zu wollen. Wie ich schon angedeutet habe, Charles Taylor war unsere Wunschbesetzung, die realisieren zu können, wir kaum zu hoffen gewagt hatten. Und tatsächlich verkörpert er in ganz vorbildlicher Weise das, was wir hier zwischen Gesellschaftsanalyse, Philosophie und praktischem Eingriff machen möchten. Der kanadische Philosoph Charles Taylor ist nämlich, und Übertreibung wäre hier gar nicht möglich, einer der bekanntesten, einflussreichsten und inspirierendsten Philosophen der Welt, erzählt ohne Zweifel zu den bedeutendsten Denkern der Gegenwart. Er hat in der philosophischen Welt so viel bewegt, so viele Möglichkeiten des Denkens und Verstehens eröffnet, wie sonst nur ganz, ganz wenige Philosophen seiner Generation. Und er hat durch die immense Reichweite seiner Interessen früh Brücken zwischen ganz unterschiedlichen Traditionen und Denkweisen in der Philosophie gebaut, von denen wir nur hoffen können, dass sie unter dem Zwang verwissenschaftlicher Spezialisierung nicht wieder abbrechen. Sein Interesse an den grundlegenden anthropologischen Fragen des Verhältnisses des Menschen zu sich und zur Welt, dessen, was uns in der Welt und in unserem Verhältnis zu ihr ausmacht, und sein Interesse an den Fragen des menschlichen Zusammenlebens gingen dabei früh schon Hand in Hand und entfalteten sich zunächst an wissenschaftstheoretischen Fragestellungen. Taylors grundlegende Einsicht, aber immer eben auch schon mit einem Interesse an Politik und auch involviert sein in Politik und Fragen der gesellschaftlichen Aktualität. Seine grundlegende Einsicht, dass der Mensch sich aus dem Gesamt seiner sozialen und historischen Bezüge heraus versteht und verstehen lässt, dass er sich mit Marx gesagt nur in Gesellschaft vereinzeln kann und sein Verständnis des Menschen als eines sich selbst interpretierenden Lebewesens führt dabei zu einem genuin sozialphilosophischen Ausgangspunkt. Im Zusammenleben der Menschen, wie es sich in sozialen Kooperationsverhältnissen manifestiert, die sie eingehen, treffen immer schon bestimmte und auch normative Vorstellungen über die richtige Gestaltung der gemeinsamen Welt aufeinander. Damit sind Konflikt und Differenzen, aber auch die Notwendigkeit des Erschaffens und Gestaltens einer gemeinsamen Grundlage gesetzt. Geschult an Hegel, dessen Werk Taylor in einer einflussreichen Neulektüre auf ungeahnte Weise zu aktualisieren vermochte und damit nicht nur im angelsächsischen Raum Hegel gewissermaßen salonfähig gemacht hat, sondern auch umgekehrt auf die Rezeption, die wir hier wiederum neu aufgenommen haben, einen sehr großen Einfluss gehabt hat. Ausgehend und geschult an Hegel lassen sich nun spezifische Entwicklungsmuster der Moderne ausmachen, denen er sich in 2 monumentalen Monographien gewidmet hat. Die Monographie zur Geschichte des Selbst, den Quellen des Selbst und der zur Säkularisierung, in denen Charles Taylor die Widersprüche der Moderne aus deren innere Entwicklung heraus, aus deren Verengungen und Vereinseitigungen heraus verständlich gemacht hat. Dabei hat er nicht nur parallel dazu, weil er immer auch wieder direkt eingegriffen hat in Fragen der Politik, des Multikulturalismus, der Demokratie, sondern auch gewissermaßen in dieser Grundlagenarbeit, die Grundlagen und die Gefahren der Demokratie immer schon mit thematisiert, die in der letzten Zeit so sehr in den Mittelpunkt seiner Forschung und auch seines Wirkens gerückt sind. Sie sehen also, passender könnte derjenige, der hier die Vortragsreihe mit seinen Überlegungen zur Krise der Demokratie, zu den Krisen der Demokratie entwickelt, gar nicht gewählt sein. An 3 aufeinanderfolgenden Abend also wird Charles Taylor zur Demokratie und ihren Krisen vortragen und dabei immanente Verfallsphänomene gegenwärtiger Demokratien wie die politische Entfremdung, die wachsende Ungleichheit und Ausgrenzung, aber, und das wird die letzte dieser Vorträge sein, auch mögliche Wege aus der Krise der Demokratie beleuchten. Dieses Thema ist, das können Sie sich vorstellen, könnte aktueller und drängender nicht sein. Worüber sollte man eigentlich sonst reden angesichts der Europawahlergebnisse, angesichts der erneuten Verfolgung kritischer Wissenschaftler an vielen Orten der Welt, angesichts des Auftauchens autoritärer Regime, angesichts der Verarmung der öffentlichen Debattenkultur und der Aushöhlung kollektiver Selbstbestimmung zugunsten marktkonformer Sachzwänge. Worüber sollte man sonst reden, wenn nicht über die Krise der Demokratie? Es kommt aber darauf an, wie man darüber redet und ob man diese Krise für eine Oberflächenerscheinung hält, ein plötzlich zugestoßenes oder etwas, was gewissermaßen in der Anlage der gesellschaftlichen Institutionen schon angelegt ist. Genau das tut Charles Taylor. Worüber sonst also, außer über die Krise der Demokratie, sollte man reden, aber mit wem sonst würden wir lieber darüber reden, als mit Charles Taylor und den Kommentatorinnen, die wir dazu gewinnen konnten, diese Vorträge hier zu begleiten. Die Abfolge der nächsten Tage, Sie können das auch den Programmen, die Sie auf Ihren Tischen finden, entnehmen, ist also der Auftakt heute mit dem Titel Losing Faith in Democracy. Heute wird Maeve Cooke, die ich Ihnen dann gleich noch vorstellen werde, vom University College Dublin den Vortrag kommentieren. Morgen geht es dann um Marketization and Polarization. Den Kommentar wird Patricia Nanz vom IISS Potsdam halten. Und schließlich am Mittwoch die Lösung aller aufgeworfenen Probleme, What can be done? Und den Kommentar wird diesmal Zhang Shuangli von der Fudan University in Shanghai halten. Wir werden jeweils eben diesen Kommentar, eine kurze Replik Charles Taylors auf den Kommentar, aber dann auch eine Öffnung ins Publikum ermöglichen. Sie können also Fragen stellen. Die Vorträge finden in englischer Sprache statt, also wir gehen jetzt gleich ins Englische über. Die Fragen können aber auch auf Deutsch gestellt werden. Charles Taylor versteht sehr gut Deutsch, spricht auch gut Deutsch. Wir werden im Zweifelsfall auch einfach Fragen übersetzen, also scheuen Sie sich nicht, auch dann teilzunehmen, wenn Sie Ihre Frage nicht auf Englisch stellen wollen. Schließlich ganz zum Schluss schon einmal vorsorglich der Dank an alle Mitarbeiterinnen des Centers, an alle Mitarbeiterinnen der Stiftung für Humanities and Social Change, insbesondere auch den studentischen Mitarbeitenden, die Sie hier überall gesehen haben, die mit sehr viel Tatkraft das alles ermöglichen. Auch ein ganz besonderer Dank geht an die Techniker, die HU, die im letzten Moment noch ermöglicht haben, dass wir hier doch noch etwas bessere akustische Möglichkeiten vorfinden oder jedenfalls die auf uns hier genau zugeschnitten sind. Und natürlich sowohl den Kommentatorinnen als auch Charles Taylor, der die weite Reise hierhin auf sich genommen hat, in den letzten Wochen bereits unermüdlich mit uns diskutiert hat und den ich jetzt gerne ans Podium bitten möchte. Welcome, Charles Taylor. We are so happy to have you.
I think suddenly you can hear me, I hope. And I hope that if I speak like this, normally, even people in the back can understand me. Well, here I stand, and it's with a sense of great honor, but also I'm a little bit intimidated by the prospect of discussing such an important issue in Berlin under the name of Walter Benjamin. It's a very high standard that I have that I'm forced to look towards. And so, actually, this work that I'm going to talk about tonight is very much a work in progress. And I've been here 5 or 6 weeks, and we've had a number of very interesting discussions, which I had mentioned earlier. So the lectures I'm going to give tonight are not the ones I would have given if I had started talking immediately on arriving here. And it's going to go on because we're going to have some interesting exchanges after these lectures. And then it's going to go on after that. I have to tell you that this is going to be a book, but not a book by me alone, but with 2 other collaborators, Craig Calhoun and Dilip Gaunkar. So tonight I'll be talking some of my ideas, but also I'll be channeling my 2 co-authors to a certain extent. And I hope that in the end of all this, we'll all understand this better. Now, the context of the whole thing is our regular excitement and sense of movement and then disappointment with the spread of democracy. If you look back over the last century and a few decades, we had at the end of the First World War, at the end of the Second World War, at the moment, we have the Charité right here, so we're going to get, at the moment of the decolonization, and then again, of course, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had these moments of thinking, yes, now democracy will advance, and in our more happy and optimistic moments, we thought it'll advance and it'll not retreat because it will fulfill the lives of its people so much and so clearly that there won't be a retreat from democracy. And each time we've been disappointed, and I think rather shaken the 4th time, that is what resulted from the fall of the wall. We see recently in even the older centers of Western democracy, we see a deviation into what we have to consider something really fundamentally against the values that democracy defends. So I think we shouldn't be surprised by this. So one of the theses I want to develop here is that democracy, our democracy, I'll try to define more exactly what that is in a minute, has certain susceptibilities to decay, to degenerate, to fall off. So that's bad news. But it's also good news because if we get clear on what these are, then we know what to do and there are certain countermeasures we can try to take. And that's the structure of these 3 talks, is I want to talk about 3 of these tendencies to decay, to degenerate, 1 tonight, 2 tomorrow, and then on Wednesday, if you still have patience to hear, comes on Wednesday comes an agenda, which, if followed, could lead eventually to the answer. But this needs much further exploration. So I'm going to try to give a theory of democracy. Actually, it owes a lot to Tocqueville. The idea is that democracy, and I'll give further adjectives in a minute, but democracy in its different forms is always a form of social life with its own internal normativity, its own internal values built into it. You can't understand it unless you understand the values that move the people who live in it and that it's meant to realize. But these are always particular to this form. It's going to follow that a lot of what I say is going to be exaggeratedly universal because I'm going to try to cover a lot of societies. But the point is that you have to come to a sense of what these inner values, these inner goals of democracy, in any case, are, in order to know how to defend it, how to destroy it. Some people are already using their knowledge to do that, and how it develops. So as I say, it's one of my great models, which also I feel very intimidated by, is Tocqueville. Tocqueville's great books on democracy in America. Of course, he had his fundamental values himself. He was in favor of this movement to equality in history, but he wanted to understand how they worked in this society and what could make that society deviate and destroy its basic values. When he talks about the tyranny of the majority and soft despotism, and also wants to work out what are the features of that society which really give it its force and impel it forward and must be preserved. And that's, of course, all this whole set of activities of voluntary associations which he had in mind. So I'm not going to follow Tocqueville, but I'm inspired by Tocqueville. It's the same kind of operation. Now, as a matter of fact, since Rachel sent me her Lebensform book, I think it's also something that the kind of thing she's trying to do with the concept of a form of life, a Lebensform. Right? You get an idea of what its internal goals are, and then you can get an idea of when it's deviating, what to do about that, how to overcome them, and so on. All right, so let me dive into it by looking at what I think are certain basic features of democracy, and as I said, which are susceptible to be well developed and susceptible also to be undermined. And as I said, I'm going to talk about one tonight and two tomorrow. And because I think that our present crisis of democracy around what people call, I think, too loosely populism, but you know what I mean, xenophobic populism, our present crisis is a result of a combination of three kinds of degeneration that we are susceptible to, that we can fall into. They sometimes happen separately, but they happen to be coming about now in some kind of synergy, very, very bad and very evil synergy, but they're nevertheless there. Well, the first one I want to talk about is how the democracy can go against its basic telos. Now, why do I say telos here? I think what I want to offer here is a telic concept of democracy, and let me give you a sense of what that is. Telic concept of a social form is where you present the goals it's aiming at all the time. And this doesn't mean that you think that most of the time, or even any of the time, it really has arrived fully at those goals, because they can be very exigent. But it's nevertheless extremely important to grasp the telos, because that you begin to grasp what drives people to try to create this form, what threatens it, and so on. Right? So there are, of course, a number of different telae that our modern democracies defend or are defined by, because we're not just talking about democracy in the Greek sense, the demos rule. We're talking about democracy which is universal, inclusive, egalitarian, non-discriminatory, all those things together. We're talking about a democracy that comes post the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, right, that has been informed by that. So there are a number of precisely these telae, these goals, which we fail fully to instantiate, to realize. But the reason why this is a helpful concept is that we can see what's going on here, as a struggle, as a striving to realize them, and then facing various forms of opposition which take us away from them. And the one I want to talk about this morning, there are many tele, as I said, but the one I want to talk about this morning is the one that is inscribed in the name. You know, if you put the name, the word demos and the word kratos together, what do you get? Well, what you get is something very complicated, because as everybody knows, we go back to Aristotle. The demos, as he used the word, was not the whole people. The demos was the non-elite portion of the people, as against various kinds of elites, and he always had two in mind: the aristocracy, the nobility on one hand, and the rich on the other hand, right? So his idea, as you know, was that democracy was the one-sided rule of the demos, of the non-elites, over the elites, and it kind of was the equal opposite of oligarchy, which is the rule of the various elites over the non-elites. And so the ideal for him was some kind of balance, which he called politeia, which really can be translated republic. I mean, that's after all how we translate, that's after all the name of Plato's great book that we translate the Republic. So if we look back at the American founders, for instance, we find at the beginning that democracy wasn't a good word. Democracy was a dirty word. And because they looked at it through the Aristotelian lens, right? And on the contrary, they were founding a republic, right, with a balance, supposedly. And they were very concerned in the Federalist Papers to achieve this kind of balance. But the funny thing happened shortly thereafter. This word, which was a four-letter word in the mouths of all serious thinkers, suddenly becomes, or not suddenly, but very, very few decades, becomes what we're fighting to save the world for, what is the highest form of life. How did this happen? Well, it happened, I think you can see it reflected in the grammar and vocabulary of modern politics, where we look at the word people, folk, peuple, popolo, narod, name it, they all have two possible meanings. They all can mean the entire population, or they mean precisely the non-elites. In other words, they translate the Greek words laos or demos, or the Latin words populus or plebs, right? They translate both these words. I mean, they combine both these words. And what's underlying this is the notion that these two meanings should somehow approach each other. And they would approach each other in a really equal society in which the non-elites ultimately had the influence proportionate to their numbers, right? So that they, equally with anyone else from the elites, would have a say in what happens and what's decided and how history goes on. But that's exactly the point where we can see here a teleconcept, that it can sort of come close to happening, but the idea that we could ever get there and stay there forever is obviously an illusion. Why? Well, because even if we get there at a certain point, that is, we have really, anyway, a sense that people have in the demos, I'm using this word in the Greek sense now, that they have a real say, it couldn't last for a number of reasons, but I want to mention two, and perhaps the most important and obvious, is that as history goes on, the bases of power, of elite power, change. Now, if we go right back again to the beginnings of the modern democracy, which are really the French and American revolutions, would take the American one. At the beginning, of course, this was not democracy in our full sense, right? Because I said in our full sense, let's say after 1948 in the West, it includes equality, inclusion, and so on. And the democracy then was the democracy of white men, right? Not women, not the other two races in America, as Stockfield described them, they were out of it. But nevertheless, in that narrow compass, there was still this sense of a demos and others. That's what the whole Federalist Constitution was meant somehow to balance, with extremely ironic results. You remember the U.S. Electoral College was meant to allow calm reflection by wise people on the stupider votes of the voters, and to put the right person into the White House. After what happened in 2016, you can see Sikh transit. But then the power was land. So the demos, having some influence, produced a regime which by, of course, despoliation of the Aboriginals, alas, in my country too, gave land, cheap land to people, and they moved out west and they set up there. Then later came the railways, later came the large industry, and another base of power exploiting those same people who had their free land. And then there was the Sherman antitrust law and other measures by Theodore Roosevelt, and then we get the large-scale international economy which produces the Great Depression, and then we get Roosevelt and the New Deal and so on. In other words, what we're seeing here at best is a series of movements where what looks like a good way of realizing the telos of democracy, the kratos to the demos, at one moment just ceases to be at another moment because the situation changes. But of course, secondly, it's quite normal and understandable that those same elites are not terribly happy to share totally power, so they're also interested in pushing the envelope to a certain degree. And these two factors together produce a kind of, at best, a kind of oscillation in history. And I think we can see that happening, right? I mean, after the New Deal and the building of the welfare states, planned economies for full employment, large number of trade unions in Western European societies, producing the post-war, what the French called les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years after 1945. Then we've had a move away from that again, right? So we have almost these two things are combined in a sense, two factors combined, the situation changes, and at the same time, there are various attempts, various ideologies like neoliberalism, which try to convince people that they don't need to take certain measures, and the situation slides back. That's what I mean by a telic concept. Well, now, if we never get there, what's the point of trying? The point of trying is that everything really important is in the direction of movement. In a direction of movement where people begin to feel that, yes, we can build a democracy. There's a tremendous excitement, there's a tremendous engagement, there's a great sense of morale, and also the creation of real relations of solidarity, which are deeply meaningful to people, that we belong together and we're working together. In the moments, I mean the periods when we're sliding away, you get the opposite of that. You get cynicism, you get discouragement, you get, oh, well, what's the point of voting? They're all crooked, or they're controlled by other forces. You get a great deal of cynicism and also anger. We can see this, I want to cite some examples later on, right? So the really important issue is not have we got there so that we can never be displaced, but are we moving in that direction, or are we drifting, being pushed away from it? And so you can see that this telic concept, of course, is a peculiar kind of concept. There are other concepts of democracy, if you like, let's call them on-off. Telic is we're more and more and more, or less and less and less. On-off, or just we take a certain number of criteria and we tick the boxes, like Freedom House. Do they have free and fair elections? Do they have free press? Et cetera, et cetera. Are people allowed to express their opinions? Tick, tick, tick. It's a democracy. Now, I'm not in any way knocking that concept. It has its use. But the concept I'm proposing, I may be wrong in its detail, but a concept of that kind, telic concept, is crucial to me because I think that is how the whole operation is lived. See, I described what it's like to be moving towards. In moments, like, well, I mean, right after Tahrir Square in Egypt, I mean, alas, what happened, but right after that moment, when people really feel, yes, we can move, or after the wall fell in various countries in Eastern Europe, those moments are really magic moments of great power, the creation of solidarities, the creation of contacts and building of institutions, right? There's something very exciting about that. And these other moments are moments of great discouragement. So what I'm claiming here is, this is how democratic history, good or bad, is lived. It's the le monde vécu, it's the erlebnis of being in a democracy in either of these directions is characterized in these forms. Whereas a nice on-off concept, very useful for classifying who's a democracy and not, doesn't touch that kind of very deep motivation. But if I'm right that what we want is the understanding democracy as a life form, we want to understand how it's lived, how it is experienced, how it is felt in its various phases. Right? And there are many, many words for this. The one that I've invented and I picked up and a bit twisted in my own direction, but is social imaginary, the kind of sense we have of what we're doing together. So one of the reason why I'm saying it's important to look at my Tita concept and not at, let's say, Schumpeter. Schumpeter's theory is very much an on-off concept. A lot of people vote, and then they go home and they vote for one elite or another elite, and though that elite gets elected, that just goes on running the show, and the people should go home and stay home and not bother them. And then 4 years later, there's another election, and if they really haven't done the job, you kick them out and put in a new group. Well, that completely passes beside without mentioning this phenomenon of the demos, the inherent telos of demos, kratos, about the demos, that doesn't exist at all in the Schumpeterian theory. And I think it's important to see that is missing something. Now, what has been happening in this period, let's say since 1975, 80? Well, on the level of the lived experience, we have a growing sense of the decline. I want to call the word I want to use here is citizen efficacy, the sense that, yes, we can do something. Yes, we can affect our fate, right? That's a subjective, if you like, concept of how I understand that I have, or I believe I have, or we have, or I and my associates have some power to influence it. So the decline of this is a sense of inefficacy, and that has been growing. And this is one of the great decays, if you like, declines, degenerations of democracy, which I would argue is at the origin of our present discontents, combined with the other two I want to mention, particularly, of course, combined with various kinds of xenophobic narrowing of how we understand the demos. These two together have produced a lot of the really bad phenomena that we find ourselves deeply shaken by, and we want to find a way of fighting, right? I want to argue that without this sense of citizen inefficacy, without this sense of deprivation, the appeals of various demagogues, which have been all too successful, would have fallen on deaf ears. And so it's one of the things we have to get clear about. But it's not just that people feel a certain sense of citizen inefficacy. It's also that a lot of people have actually lost something very important in this period moving away from 1975, right? And I think you can see, and here I'm making outrageous generalizations in a way, because I'm trying to cover really the whole sort of Western European, North American, Australia, New Zealand, kind of, sort of, let's say, older democracies, right? And in the same category, and there are important differences. But I would like to argue that in all these cases, you have analogous groups who have lost out and feel that they've really been deprived of something. And there are two dimensions of this deprivation which I think are evident in a lot of countries. One is people, working class people, who, in the context of les Trente Glorieuses, of the post-war boom, had regular, high-paying jobs for life, very often with benefits. And of course, this means that at that moment, as a supplement to the welfare state, there was what people call Fordist modes of production, right, with lifetime employment of that kind. And now they, or their children, are facing a world in which such jobs are rarer and rarer. And the jobs they can get are temporary, they're precarious, ill-paid. At any moment, it might be farmed out to some other operation, so it would disappear. That's one dimension of great discontent. So you see that in the United States, in various of the areas, and of the Rust Belt areas that voted for Trump. You see it in France, in what they call the diagonale du vide, running from northeast France right down to southwest, which was the area where there was a great deal of industrial activity before. People that voted communist for decades and decades who are now voting for Madame Le Pen. So this kind of thing can be found in a great many, less in this country, but than in others. But let's take the UK, who voted for Brexit. Well, I mean, apart from Boris Johnson and other such people, there were lots of workers in the former industrial heartland, Lancashire in the northeast and so on, who are now exactly in the same position of decline and who voted solidly for Brexit. I mean, a lot of them voted for Brexit and so on. So we can go on and on. There are differences, but we have here some kind of common complaints, if you like, common sense of, well, let me mention the other one, and we put them together. The other sort of dimension or vector of discontent is smaller centers, which have steadily since the Second World War, really, but particularly since the 70s, been losing to larger centers. I think there are 10 large cities in the United States which are growing gigantically, but a whole lot of smaller centers are losing. So they may lose the local newspaper, they may lose the local bank branch, they may lose various services like bus services and train services which cease to go there. In Britain, I read a really very heart-wrenching story of a northern county where old people just can't get to some place where they can meet others and get some kind of care and back in the same day because of the cutting of bus services, so they either have to go there and stay there or not go at all, and very often they don't go at all, right? This kind of, and of course you have in France the sapping and almost death of La France profonde. This is something that a lot of people are very deeply attached. That is very living communities that have been there for years and have long traditions and so on. So somebody puts a big supermarket here, and a lot of the villages around, the various shops go to business and so on. And that's very much one of the things that's behind les Gilets jaunes, right? The yellow vests protest against Macron, right? So we have these two vectors of decline, and you could put it this way, that the people concerned feel that their standard of living is under steady downward pressure. I mean, and comparing them and their children and maybe their children's children, it looks like a steady vector of decline. And so we have here these two things together. On one hand, a sense of declining citizen efficacy, right? On the other hand, these real wrongs and these real declines, these real sufferings that they're going through, the combination is explosive, right? Because it's exactly at the moment that you find that your kids can't find the kind of job that you looked for and wanted, that you want to be able to go and knock on someone's door and maybe smash in the window and say, do something about it, and feel helpless in that situation is very, very bad. So we get where this picture I gave earlier of a kind of alternation, which you can see in history, in the history of democracy, between movements forward and movements backward. We're in one of those alternations, I hope at the end of a decline, because one of the things we've got to do is to reverse this movement. And then we have to look at, of course, all the things that brought this about, right? The decline of Fordist production, the oil crisis, the end of Bretton Woods, and above all, globalization and robotization together have undercut those steady jobs in these kind of advanced industrial countries. I mean, this globalization has done wonders to equalize in another dimension, because it's brought whole populations out of extreme poverty, right, in the third world. So it's great job of equalization has been done. But where no attention was paid by governments in the Western world was how the price of this was distributed locally. So who paid for that most? Well, precisely these workers that I mentioned and these smaller centers that I mentioned. And in the context of the last 30 years, it somehow slipped the minds of slipped the intentions of even left-wing parties, even social democratic parties, that something ought to be done about this. And there's a very interesting to conjecture a little bit why. I think one of the important features, one of the important things that brought that about was the hold of certain kind of unreflexive neoliberalism. By neoliberalism, I mean very simply unjustified confidence in markets to redistribute in a human way what the gains are that these markets help produce. Right? In other words, it's a kind of negative doctrine that you don't need to step in and do something about this in order to make sure that there are some populations don't have an exaggerated and totally unjust share of the burden of this, rise in global production, right? And for some reason, our political elites became more and more complacent about this, so that when 2008 happened, in the case of Europe, okay, this is where I'm now sort of a bit entrenching on the third lecture, right? But in the case of Europe, people were so concerned about overloading with debt and so on that they didn't come to the rescue. Of course, in the first case, it was Greece, which was hung out to dry in the most horrible and I think utterly immoral way, because they were given a plan which everybody knew they were going to fail at and fail at and fail at and fail at and fail at. They're going to go on. But also the rest of Europe. In the English case, there was again this austerity. Now you might say, what's the alternative? Well, that's exactly what I want to talk about on Wednesday, but I mean, there's got to be an alternative, because if there is no alternative, we're heading for the end of the kind of democracy we want to build. But so I'll just leave that hanging there as to what are the alternatives. But we have, in other words, in this development, we have not only the steady work of Hayek and people who think like him trying to persuade people which was kind of easy to do with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and so on. But I think we have something much more worrying, which is that a lot of people went along with that went along with the basic policy or lack of policy or lack of even asking questions about policy, which were dictated by that without necessarily having worked through and said, yeah, we think Hayek is the greatest genius that ever came onto the economic scene. So, see, the problem is with this kind of decline, and it's kind of citizen efficacy. And I'm going to say the same thing about the other two degenerations tomorrow, is that they don't automatically correct themselves. It's not like an auto-correcting market. They left without political initiative, they worsen. Why? Well, so I find that I don't see any way that my vote's going to count, so I don't vote. But then, of course, I'm even more disempowered. People like me even more disempowered, and we feel even more that it's somebody up there is making the decisions, so we don't vote. And you get a spiral. You can get a spiral there, which ends up with the situation worsening. Or another dimension, people don't vote as much, so money has a much bigger weight in politics. This is clear in the United States. The fact that a lot of people didn't vote or were prevented from voting, I will come to that tomorrow, meant that getting people to become candidates for the Republican Party, for Congress and so on, more and more big money counted, and big money bought congressmen and congresswomen, right? So it again is a spiral down. And there's a third kind of spiral which is hard to characterize and even harder to undo. But that's what I want to call the spiral into opacity. You could call it dumbing down. I mean, it's astonishing. Did people really think that Trump was going to make America great again? Some people did. I have a feeling, which is backed up by a certain amount of evidence, that other people were voting out of a sense of impotence, but a desire to smash back at the elites that are producing this situation, right? They want to just tell them what we think of you. So Trump kept repeating, I'm not politically correct, and every time he did that, he would collect more votes, and every time people said he's a deplorable, he would collect more votes. It is a kind of move which you can see isn't necessarily based on believing that this program will actually produce a redressive grievance. I mean, perhaps the most striking case of that is the hardcore Gilets jaunes in France, right? So Macron said, well, let's have a discussion. Discussion, we want to make a plan. We don't want to make a plan. They just don't want to hear about it. But nous sommes le peuple. In a way, they reenact, this is a very powerful thing in France, they reenact the liturgy of the French Revolution and the people coming together and so on. And somehow that's more satisfying than any kind of engagement with Macron or anyone else to make a plan, right? And the fact is that in this kind of situation, the people who could be policy framers in various party think tanks and so on, are so far away from the lived experience of the people concerned that they don't know what kind of plan they should make. One of the things I want to come to on Wednesday is a big agenda. Is that we have to find ways of creating those connections that can develop new policies. So we have here a kind of situation in which things can only get worse unless there's some intervention, right? It's kind of spiraling down. And this is very, very worrying indeed. So I want to quickly see what I really have to say today. And yeah, so there's a great deal that has to be done in rebuilding the intermediate institutions, parties, movements, and so on, which I want to come to in this area. But I want to just on Wednesday, I want to finish with invoking another name, which was very much discussed in our groups in Humboldt this last week, and that's Karl Polanyi, because I think, as I read him, now we have different readings, as I read him, he had something like this basic intuition of the back and forth. With the basic idea, it seems to me, is that capitalist markets disembed, derange, make life difficult in societies. They break up communities, right, that could ordinarily control together the economic life of the society. But of course, going by the market alone is a total utopia. It's not possible. There must be some embedding. So we have a response in which we create new kinds of embedding where this kind of economic activity can be lived in a human way. So that's what we did, in a sense, after 1945 or after 32 in the United States or in Sweden also in the 30s, but basically in building the Trente Glorieuses, right? And then the production starts at a much higher level with a much more integrated world economy by corporations which don't belong to any particular society but are really spread out everywhere. They crack open the various communities that have been made on the national level, the various attempts to control and humanize, and we have to come back again. And this is, anyway, my reading of Polanyi is a kind of continuous movement. It'll never end. He's telling me I've come to the end of my time, but it will never end, but it doesn't always need to be in this direction, right? And that's, I think, the challenge we have. Well, thank you very much for your time.
So thank you so much, Charles Taylor. I can't wait to hear more, which will be tomorrow. But for now, let me introduce you to Maeve Cooke. Maeve Cooke has been educated both in Dublin and in Germany. Actually, she held a doctorate from the University of Constance, where she was working with Albrecht Wermer. And her first book is on Habermas. This is a result of this studying in Germany. Her first book, Language and Reason, a study of Habermas' pragmatics, has been out in 1994. So ever since I have known Maeve, and this is quite a long time actually, she has been thinking about the good society and the good life, and she has been, a lot of her work, a lot of her intense thinking about this has evolved around Charles Taylor's work, amongst a number of others, of course. This is a part of her work in the period in her thinking where that culminated in the book Representing the Good Society, which was out in 2006, but also in a number of very, very well-known and widely discussed articles on autonomy, the good life, and the like. Her new project now is a critical theory of the Anthropocene. So I think the comments that she's going to give here are somehow related to her new interest in the Anthropocene already. I'm very, very happy that you're here now, and very much looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Rahel, for this lovely introduction, and thank you to Charles for being here and giving me the. I feel very honoured to be responding to the first of his 3 lectures here. And Rahel is completely right to say that my thinking for a long, long time has been inspired by Charles Taylor's work. In the lecture we heard this evening and in his lectures tomorrow and the next day, Charles Taylor is inviting us to explore with him the question of democratic degeneration. His aim is to get clearer on what makes modern democracies vulnerable to decline, for this will help us to define better how democratic degeneration can be combated and perhaps even reversed. Identifying 3 tendencies to or axes of degeneration, he offers thought-provoking reflections on the complex challenges facing contemporary societies globally amidst the rise of various forms of authoritarianism. This, to many people, seems to present the best response to the immense socio-economic, political and ecological problems facing humans today. The 3 axes of degeneration are, respectively, the slide from the telos of equality towards hierarchy, the slide from the telos of inclusion towards exclusion, and the slide from democratic deliberation and contestation towards authoritarian forms of majority rule in which fixed majorities make it virtually impossible to contest and topple them. The key values here are inclusion, in the sense of full participation by all who find themselves within a given political association, equality in the sense of non-hierarchical power, and solidarity through non-authoritarian contestation. I prefer to use the word interconnectedness rather than solidarity. These values constitute the core of the democratic ideal implicit in Charles Taylor's critical discussion of the axes of democratic degeneration. This ideal is the idea of a truly equal society, a society ruled by the whole people, but without an elite that renders participation by the rest of the association ineffective. I share this democratic vision, agree that it is currently under serious threat from multiple directions, and, like Charles Taylor, am concerned with possibilities for reinvigoration and renewal of the democratic ideals or values of inclusion, equality, and interconnectedness. His discussion tonight and the subsequent lectures of the various axes of degeneration takes an important step in this direction. Implicit in his discussion is something I see as a crucial element in the process of democratic regeneration. This is something that I think should be made explicit and emphasized. The crucial element is, in my terms, transformation of ethical identities through engagement with others, human and non-human. By ethical identity transformation, I mean changes in self-understandings, behaviour and life practices in which what is at stake is the ethically right way of thinking, acting and conducting one's life. In a political context, we may speak of citizen identity transformation, again of an ethical kind. And I'm using the term citizen here loosely to refer to anybody and everybody who finds themselves within a particular political association. The specific ethical aim of citizen identity transformation is the common good, understood as a set of constitutional principles, institutions, and social practices that enable the ethically best life for every citizen. I take the view that such identity changes at individual, group, and institutional level are essential for the quality and vitality of democracy. In short, democracy, as an ideal of human political association, depends on ethical identity transformation. I find this implicit in Charles Taylor's discussion. But since I consider crucially important, let me try to make explicit what I understand by this and why I see it as so central. The third axis of democratic degeneration, about which I think we're going to hear more tomorrow night, is what Charles Taylor characterises as the definition in advance of what counts respectively as the majority and the minority, coupled with a blocking of all attempts by minority groups to unsettle this definition. In other words, the operative majority, the majority that confers power, gives itself or is given permanency. it is a fixed majority. Its hegemony is irreversible. In modern democracies, this is usually possible only if the majority is rigged, typically by way of gerrymandering and other forms of election manipulation, and by ruthless elimination of the forces of opposition. Examples could be Turkey, Russia, and Hungary. As Charles Taylor observes in his writings, and I'm sure he will say it tomorrow night, aiming for and seeking to maintain a permanent majority allows for or even demands authoritarian forms of rule. I agree with Charles Taylor that the slide of democracy into permanent majority rule is a disaster for any society. I also think he's right to contrast this form of democracy with an alternative vision of a deliberative community. And again, this is something we might hear more about in the lectures tomorrow night and the next one. This alternative vision of a deliberative community could be the one like we find in the writings of Hannah Arendt. This would be a community in which has to work out things together, respecting each other's opinions, listening to one another. The normal operations of this alternative kind of deliberative community leads inevitably to change in the constitution of the winning majority over time. The changes that occur relate not just to the elected representatives, but also, importantly, to the interests, policy convictions, and identities that are represented. The key point, as I see it, is that democracy, when it functions as an Arendtian deliberative community, depends on changes in self-understandings on the part of its members and corresponding changes in behaviour and life practices. The point is key because it signals the need to see democracy as a movement, as Charles Taylor emphasised, to see democracy as a process in which even its guiding ideals of equality, inclusion, and interconnectedness are permanently open to thoroughgoing revision in response to challenges as they arrive in specific contexts and at specific times in history. Revision requires careful examination of how these ideals are realized in the lives of specific societies, in the sense of actualized in thought, action, and social practices, and embodied within social, political, and economic institutions. Furthermore, it calls for careful examination and rigorous critique of the kinds of exclusion, inequality, and dissociation that the concrete realization of these values generates. And as an example of the need for continual revision, take the contemporary ecological challenge, which calls on humans to reconsider in a fundamental way what inclusion, equality, and interconnectedness mean in relation to non-human natural entities such as spiders, trees, or fish. For most of us, this calls for profound changes in our self-understandings and is likely to impact profoundly on our life practices. And as I mentioned earlier, I see an ethical dimension to identity change of this kind. It's a kind of identity change in which what is at stake is a coming to see what is right in an ethical sense. It is not a matter of remaking oneself playfully or aesthetically. It is not imaginative or innovative self-fabrication. And this is why it can be described as a kind of conversion. In this respect, the ecological challenge is not new. In the history of modern democracies, there have been many historical moments that have demanded fundamental ethical identity transformation. One example is the civil rights movement in the USA in the 1950s and 1960s, where the social, political, and economic transformations for which the leaders of the movement were struggling called for conversion on the part of the white majority and in some cases also of the subjugated black minority. It demanded a profound shift in perception that would enable those addressed to see how the existing social, political, and economic system generated hierarchical power, exclusion, and alienation, together with a widespread blindness to this. Furthermore, to recognise the complicity with this system of subjugation. It also called for fundamental change at an institutional level, for as I mentioned, Identity change may be necessary not just on the part of individuals and groups, but also on the part of social, political, and economic institutions. I take the view that institutions too have ethically inflected identities that should be seen as in a permanent process of construction. Since such identity change may be disturbing and painful, it is not surprising that it's generally feared and avoided or blocked, not always consciously. Democracies today need to pay great attention to the ways in which identity change is avoided or blocked, for example, by way of media-generated echo chambers, and to respond to these blockages in imaginative and effective ways. Keeping open and fostering possibilities for identity change is vital for regeneration and renewing democracy. Once we recognize this, we will see that the traditional emphasis on establishing a powerful common identity needs to be rethought. The dominant view hitherto was that democracies need a definite sense of identity. But their dependency on ongoing identity transformation suggests otherwise. Certainly, democracies need a strong sense of interconnectedness. Moreover, they always have particular identities. However, these identities should be thought of as permanently under construction, as permanently in process, not as something fixed, immobile, and in this sense definite. I would encourage Charles Taylor to pursue this line of thought. In his discussion of, in particular, the third axis of degeneration, but all the three axes are interconnected, he points in the direction of a view of democracy as dependent on ethical identity transformation. But, as I said, I'd like him to articulate this view more clearly. The need for explicit articulation is all the more important since it stands in tension with the picture of citizen identity as fixed and immobile that is implicit in mainstream liberal versions of the democratic ideal. Here, ideal equality is characterized as a condition in which all classes and groups, elites and non-elites alike, would have power proportionate to their numbers to influence and determine outcomes. And this is, of course, as we heard, Aristotle's view of the best society, or it echoes Aristotle's view of the best society as one in which there would be a balance of power between elites and non-elites. In this conception, implicitly, citizen identity transformation is not part of the ideal of democracy. Instead, the underlying picture of citizen identity is of something determined outside of the political process, as something citizens bring with them ready-made when they act politically. This picture, the traditional picture of citizen identity as fixed in advance, is coupled with an emphasis on stability, seen in turn as necessary for security and prosperity. Both Aristotle and the US founding fathers thought that democracy would bring dangerous instability, but we heard too tonight that the subsequent celebration of democracy takes over this concern for stability. Democracy then, afterwards, is seen as a regime that promises stability through the rule of law. I suggest, however, that in our times of global ecological challenge, we also need to revisit the idea of stability. In their recent book, The Politics of the Anthropocene, John Dryzek and Jonathan Pickering defined the Anthropocene as an emerging epoch of human-induced instability in the Earth system. They see this as a call to political theory to fundamentally rethink just about everything. In particular, to give up the idea that any institutional solution could provide long-term stability. Stability, they imply, is no longer a salient concept. This seems to me to go too far. Today there are deep divisions within many societies, and polarization seems to be increasing rather than decreasing. The recent and not yet concluded civil war in Syria is just one example. Some form of stability is undoubtedly the precondition for the kind of vibrant citizen engagement that Charles Taylor and I envisage. I suggest, however, that we should think of stability not as stasis, as immobility, but as a basic condition of felt interconnectedness and trust arising from a shared commitment to general democratic norms of inclusion and equality. This basic condition of stability enables citizens to act together to construct a common good by way of dynamic processes of citizen and institutional identity, formation, reformation, and transformation. Regeneration, democracy depends on this. Thank you.
So you will have the chance to respond to her. So I'll give Charles Taylor the chance to respond to Maeve Cooke, and then we'll open the floor and have time for probably around 3 questions or so. But there will be time for more public discussion the next 2 days.
Okay. So I think I'm back on again, right? You can, yes. No, I found that very interesting, and I found a lot I agreed with in it. So I'm wondering where to start a discussion. I think it might be here that I think of citizen identity as, in its very nature, in constant change, because it's a matter of creating solidarities in action. You call them interconnectedness. Okay, but that, and you become a different person if you are now recognizing that that this is an important relation to you, and it's really been very, very strong in my own experience in the fights we've had in Quebec to stop various kinds of discrimination against. Well, you find a wonderful spectrum of people, some Muslims who are believing, some unbelieving, every kind of religion, atheists and so on, and you really bond together in that kind of situation. So I think that I would like to discuss, and maybe tomorrow I'll try, I'd like to discuss this issue of identity by breaking it down a little bit. A lot of people think of identity politics as related to what you already are. I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm gay orientation, and so on, or what you have been and so on. But a great important part of our identity in a normal democratic society, is the solidarities we form as we act together. So your identity as an agent, if you like, is really transformed by participating in a democratic society. And this makes you want to relativize and see in a broader context the identities you have because of what you are, because of your past. So when we get to the third day, the thing is that a lot of these issues, the challenge to them requires the same action as, we need to create solidarities in order to get a movement going again to address grievances. We need to create solidarities in order to link people who are now sort of hating each other because they're, And we need solidarities, I think, in order to alter a certain culture of meritocracy that is developed in our society, whereby people who go away to university and get a very good education or skill and so on and start a new job or even a new startup or even Zuckerberg doing something totally new. In our present society, they somehow are being encouraged to form an extremely, I might almost say, narcissistic identity. They don't seem to realize that what they owe to the whole society that has built the institutions that they're working in. They are incapable of responding to the minimal calls for solidarity. So that, the way that these big companies, Google and other, function is just as bad as any large corporation hiding the taxes away in the Cayman Islands, or creative bookkeeping to have all the profit in a low tax area and so on. That culture has to be overcome, and I have no quick fix on Wednesday for how that can be overcome. But a very important part of it is raising the saliency and the value and the good of this kind of solidaristic action to redress grievances in society. This is but we need to undercut the whole culture of meritocracy that we now find our so-called elites living in.